One of the advantages of taking a project to a dedicated mastering facility is that it'll have a carefully tuned environment, suitable for hearing the small details and making the subtle adjustments that mastering usually involves. The speakers will have been carefully selected and positioned, and the room analyzed and tuned to ensure the most neutral response, so the mastering engineer knows that if he hears something, it really is in the mix and not an artifact of the listening environment. When mere mortals like you or I take on a mastering project, we're not likely to have that degree of control over our environment, and that's one of the drawbacks of doing your own mastering. However, just as with mixing, even if the listening environment is imperfect, it's still possible to do an effective job of mastering, just as it's possible to do a good mix in a less than ideal room. But with mastering, since the things you'll be listening for, and any tweaks you may end up making, will likely be more subtle than the kinds of issues and processing you'd apply in a mix, the contribution of the monitoring, speakers and room, is that much more critical. There are a number of monitoring issues that, again, just as with mixing, can get in the way of the most effective mastering process, so it's worth a little time to consider them. Of course, speakers are key. For mastering, you'll want a pair that has as neutral a response as possible, allowing you to hear the important details of the mix, balance, overall tonal blend, dynamics. While many people get used to mixing on speakers that are far from neutral, like the infamous Yamaha NS10s, for mastering, I'd suggest turning to more conventionally accurate studio monitors. They should be full range, not mini speakers. One of the things that needs to be evaluated in mastering is the low end of the mix. Is it full without being boomy? Do the lowest pitches come through clearly? Is there low-end muddiness from reverb? While you can listen to and enjoy music on smaller speakers, they won't reveal any potential problems in the bass if they don't extend down far enough. An 80 Hz roll-off isn't enough to convey important information about the low end at this final stage. If the project doesn't contain subsonics, the subwoofer may not be needed, assuming the speakers are suitably full range. In fact, many mastering engineers roll off the subsonic range below 30 or 40 Hz to avoid any potential issues with subsonics that may go undetected, since those frequencies are below the fundamental range of most musical instruments. But if you're involved in mastering material that does have subsonic information, like film or video sound effects, and which is likely to be heard over theater systems with subs, then you should have one to make sure you're aware of any problematic rumbling or subsonic issues. Speaker placement is also important. You want good stereo imaging and an appropriate sound field, so the standard recommendations for stereo monitoring should be carefully followed. Ideally, the speakers would be positioned with their tweeters approximately at ear level, at a 60-degree angle, forming an equilateral triangle with the primary listening position, the sweet spot. Unless they're specifically designed for wall placement, they probably should be set up free-field, at least a couple of feet from the nearest room boundaries, walls and floor, to avoid speaker-room interaction that would compromise accuracy. And, if possible, they should be positioned symmetrically with regards to the side walls, equidistant from each wall. These suggestions will help ensure the most neutral response from any monitors, especially when it comes to mastering tasks like judging left-right balance and checking the stereo sound field of a mix. Even if the main speakers are suitably voiced and positioned, you'll still want to be able to reference additional speakers as well. No two speakers, even good ones, sound alike, and one pair may reveal subtle details that go unnoticed with another. However, it might be a good idea to have one main pair, the most neutral ones available, that's used primarily, and employ the others as reality checks, what things sound like on smaller speakers or band-limited speakers, etc. You'll also want to check your work on headphones. They can reveal detail that just doesn't come through on any speakers, and sometimes a balance or an effect that sounds fine in the room just doesn't work in phones. Exactly the kind of thing you need to find out in mastering. I checked the work on both good quality headphones and earbuds, so you'll have an idea what the music will sound like to the armies of people who listen primarily on their music players. Remember, part of the job of mastering is to ensure that the music sounds good in all the environments where people are likely to listen to it. Of course, even when the speaker's response is acceptably flat, the room itself can get in the way. In smaller project rooms, low-end room issues are usually the biggest culprit. Standing waves, also known as room modes, are low-end frequency response irregularities, reflections that occur in all enclosed spaces. Certain low frequencies, whose physical wavelengths correspond to room dimensions, form isolated areas within the room where those frequencies are either boosted, antinodes, which are boomy, or cancelled, nodes, where those frequencies are lost. If the mastering person or the speakers are located in one of these spots, then what's heard is not what's in the recording, or even what's coming out of the speakers, but an irregular response that only exists in that one spot in that particular room. Any tweak made to correct for these imbalances would only be valid in that one place and would likely make the mix sound worse in any other listening environment. It's beyond the scope of this course to cover possible acoustic treatments to remedy this. Look for our courses on acoustics. But at the very least, you can look up how to map out these problem areas and avoid them with appropriate placement of speakers and primary listening position, the sweet spot. Anyone who's more serious about mastering will want to consult books and online materials that go into the issue in greater detail and make whatever adjustments are possible to tame the worst of these modes if they want to be confident in their decision-making when it comes to the low end. Mid and high frequency reflections can be problematic as well. If the listening environment is too reflective, flutter echoes and general liveness can interfere with the ability to perceive detail in the audio, especially when psychoacoustic-based effects were used in a mix. The worst of these should be addressed by putting up absorptive material in selected locations throughout the room, especially in the front half of the room, where such reflections will be the most likely to interfere. Again, thorough coverage of the various approaches to managing reflections is beyond the scope of this course, but consulting the many articles and guides available would be time well spent. Besides potentially problematic reflections in the front of the room, the overall liveness of the room is important. You wouldn't want to go overboard damping down reflections. The room needs to be live enough for comfortable listening, just without excessive reverb or echo of its own. Usually the rear end of the room is left more live, with diffusers employed, which scatter the reflected sound, making for a more evenly distributed room tone. Commercial ones are available, but in a pinch, even a shelf of books of irregular sizes can help, at least a little. Now you'll have noticed that most of these monitoring caveats for mastering are the same concerns as you'd have for mixing, the same concerns you'd have for any room where critical decisions will be made at any stage of production. But these issues are even more critical for mastering because not only does it involve what are usually more subtle issues and adjustments, but because it's the last chance to get it right. So, even though it may involve a bit of research, the effort put toward optimizing the monitors in the room will be time well spent. Monitoring issues are one area where the biggest don't may simply be don't compromise.